The Native American West has had a long-term relationship with the Native American Rights Fund. And since you're all here waiting for the speaker, I'll just say, some of you have heard this before, but I moved here in 1984. I had no friends, and a mutual friend told me to go meet John Echohawk. And John Echohawk was my first friend in Boulder, and I'm sure for a period of time that was a little bit troubling to him, he was my only friend in Boulder. So whenever I wanted to have lunch with a friend, 303-447-8760, that is the number of the Native American Rights Fund. And I have that committed to memory because that really saved me in those first months in Boulder. So this relationship is extremely important to me personally, and important, I hope, in bigger ways, because when I wrote The Legacy of Conquest, John Echohawk read chapters of that and advised and counseled me on it when I was, at every step and stage of the game, I just kept thinking, this is an extraordinary thing for the Center of the American West to be 2 blocks away from the most important Indian advocacy group in the country. What a privilege and a joy to be so close. And as you may notice, if you walk down Broadway and over towards Mackey, you may notice that there is a path deepened in the sidewalk there, which is produced by me going back and forth and others from the Native American Rights Fund coming towards us. And there's a number of NARF people here who we take great joy in the collaboration. And Steve Moore, you must have found a seat. Where are you, Steve? And, see, there you are with the Indian water rights issues. And there's, good Lord, right, if we start doing that, well, that would have to be, that's a very good idea. Why don't we talk, actually, who is Ray Ramirez from Native American Rights Fund? There's a slew of folks from NARF here, so. And yet, conspicuously absent is the one we're hoping for. So, okay, so aged people who would like a seat. How's that going for you? Are you? There are several reserved seats, which really, it would have been invidious and uncomfortable to say very old people for the thing. But and it doesn't even have to be very old people. But some of you, I saw a few white-haired people there looking for. Well, now they're shy. Now I put too much focus on them. So they are. Oh, this is looking good here. This is looking really good. That we're headed towards. Now I have some funny anecdotes that I'd like to tell you. But I think now I can head into something more substantive and saying that a great moment for me a number of years ago, Walter Echohawk, this is kind of different. Instead of me pleading with people at NARF to have lunch with me, this was an occasion where Walter Echohawk contacted me and said he would like to get together and talk about a project. Well, that's different, instead of me bugging and asking them to hang out with me. So that was a great opportunity for him to tell me this wonderful idea that he wanted to write a book on the 10 worst decisions made by the Supreme Court on Indian affairs. And of course, his first remark was, that's going to be hard to choose of the 10 worst.
Only 10?
Yeah, quite. Well, the 10 worst. Remember, the word is worst. So that was going to be, oh, dear me, there's Carol Harvey, the head of the Colorado American Indian Commission. There she is. So, and here's Walter Echohawk. No, is that Walter Echohawk? So I was assuming he was coming right behind. Well, Charles Wilkinson, the distinguished Charles Wilkinson. There's John Echohawk. I can see. Oh, it's getting better and better every moment. The relief from my company is really on the horizon here. So that was a wonderful opportunity to discover that Walter not only was going to write this great book, but he had thoughts about how he might involve the Center of the American West. So I am now, what a blessing to see you. It's great. I can sing, I can do things, I can do various things, but it's confusion and thinking that that was pure relief that I was going to stop talking, but no, in fact, this is really about our visitor here, and so it is such a honor and pleasure to say that the Center of the American West did have an involvement in the book that Walter Echohawk will be speaking about, and it is really a pleasure and privilege now to go sit on the floor here. So thank you. And Charles Wilkinson will say, I should say that. Charles Wilkinson will speak for a moment or two and introduce our speaker, and then at the conclusion, after Walter Echohawk has spoken, his cousin John Echohawk, the executive director of the Native American Rights Fund, will talk a little bit about the future of what happens after the story that Walter Echohawk will tell us about. So, okay. Excuse me. Woohoo! Sorry. There are books available for purchase afterwards. Very important announcement. Sorry.
Well, thank you all so much for coming out. This Modern Indian Identity series of the Center for the American West has really been excellent over time and brought very distinguished people, including Walter, to the campus. There are many board members from the Center of the American West, and I wonder if they might stand.
Many.
And I know that Bob Barron, the president of Fulcrum Books, which published Walter's recent book in the courts of the Conqueror, is here tonight, and we thank Fulcrum for putting that book out in such wonderful fashion. Walter Echohawk, who served as staff attorney for the Native American Rights Fund for more than 3 decades, and now practices Indian law in an of-counsel role with an Oklahoma firm, is one of the leading figures in the first wave of Indian lawyers, a group that went where Indian people had never gone before, a group that changed the world. The recipient of many honors, including the prestigious Judge Sarah T. Hughes Award from the Federal Bar Association. Walter is everything that a lawyer can be: resourceful advocate in court, creative writer of laws whose drafts became statutes, and reflective author and colleague. He is also more than a lawyer can be, at least more than lawyers had ever been before. For nearly 2 centuries, the Indian voice was blotted out and never to be heard in the places where the rights of Indian people were decided. The elaborate committee rooms where legislators debate and decide, and the high-ceilinged chambers where judges rule. But now, Walter's voice, firm, fair, eloquent, knowing, and utterly authentic, has been heard on critical matters of religious freedom, repatriation of Indian remains and relics wrongly taken, water rights, Indian people imprisoned, and tribal sovereignty. The results of his work are now written in the law and history books, but they are also felt by Indian people across Indian country who now live in a better world because of it. Part 3 of his book, In the Courts of the Conqueror, is entitled The Spirit world. Of course, such a concept is thought to be foreign to the American legal system. But perhaps the crowning achievement of Walter, who himself lives in both the world of the law and the spirit world, is the way he has infused Indian spirituality into the nation's laws. And his work lives on. He is beloved among young Native attorneys, and his example will always be both inspiration and guide to them. He broke wholly new ground, and that gives them courage to believe that they can do it also. Walter, thank you for all you have done and for being here tonight.
Thank you, Charles. Try to use this metaphor tonight. I'm deeply moved by that wonderful, wonderful introduction, Charles. He is one of my mentors and early teachers, who taught me to become a lawyer, and I'm really grateful for that, I appreciate. I'm deeply moved by that wonderful introduction, Charles. And I'm very glad to be here tonight. What a wonderful, wonderful crowd. It's so moving to see so many people and relatives, clients. I'd like to acknowledge my Klamath clients that are here tonight. If you gentlemen might want to stand and be recognized from Klamath, Oregon. I want to speak tonight about my book, In the Courts of the Conqueror, A Native American Experience. But before I do, I have to give thanks to a whole bunch of people because this was a real collaborative effort. I need to first of all thank the Center of the American West for my presence here tonight and putting on this event. Kurt and Patty, if you guys are wonderful, and I really appreciate not only your putting on this event, but the warm hospitality and the wonderful meal that we had this evening, treating me just like home. And certainly this is my home away from home. And I thank you for that. I've been a long admirer of the Center for the American West, the leadership, the innovation, the scholarship in looking at our region, the American West, a world-famous place where we all live, and this center has played a very innovative role, in assessing the changing cultures here, as diverse peoples living on the same land. So I'm glad to be here, honored to be a part of your program, and I think I have to also say that this center is responsible for making my book. When I first sat down was contemplating writing it, I went to Patty Limerick and sat down with her. At that time I was a litigating attorney for the Native American Rights Fund, and I just didn't know if I had the time, the resources to put this book together. And she had immediately, thought it was a great project and provided all of the support of the center for me, in the form of many of our history students, that are acknowledged in the book that had come forward and done a lot of the historical work for this book. Jason Hansen as well, that had, and Jason Van Horn who's here, Donna who's here. I had a small army of very nice history students that did the historical work. Amy Bowers from PU, a lot of the law students from the CU program, helped put this together, But I would hope that the center would consider this book one of your own, and your contributions, one of your many contributions to the literature and the research, about our beloved region here, the American West. And I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge my publisher, if I could, Bob and Charlotte Barron. If you could come in and take a bow, if you would. Fulcrum Press, as you know. Bob is the founder of this very important publishing company that has brought forward such important voices as Vine Deloria and many others to the forefront of empowering our Native people, our writers, to become part of the discourse of American and the American public. And I appreciate them and their company for all of the support in making this book possible. And I'm just so overwhelmed, with my colleagues that are here. I see so many friends and relatives here in the audience, clients, and some of my early teachers, that are here. It's just very overwhelming. And many of my longtime colleagues, with the Native American Rights Fund, I have to acknowledge you. I think that you all have gone down in history, or you've made history here, with in federal Indian law, our tribal sovereignty movement, and it's certainly been my privilege of working with the Native American Rights Fund. And I just wanted to share some of that oral tradition, in the late 1960s, must have been in the late 1969 or early 70. Two men were driving to Boulder from Denver, and they stopped at this vista up here, overlooking Boulder, and they were it was Browning Pipestem and David Getches, and these were two young attorneys at that time, coming from divergent traditions. But they were coming in search of a home for this Native American Rights Fund. And both of these gentlemen influenced me in my life. Browning, coming from my own tribal area in Oklahoma, a person that I had looked up to in my life, the late Browning Pipestem, a few years older than myself, very steeped in his tribal tradition, and knew it was an encyclopedia of Indian songs, of the Oto tribe, and had implanted in him that sense of humor that the Plains Indians are well known for. But was a very powerful lawyer and someone that we looked up to. And then also David Getches, who was a brilliant young attorney at that time that had very high ideals and values in pursuit of justice that I think are still instilled in me to this very day, But these two individuals, Browning pulled the car over on this vista, and as you see the flat irons and our gorgeous community here, and he said, "We're going to locate the Native American Rights Fund right here," And so they did found our office just a couple blocks from here, and since then, down to the present, I don't know how many hundreds, John, of attorneys have gone through the halls, and law clerks have gone through our offices, and on to other areas. And many of the attorneys have stayed here in the community as sort of a colony, I guess, if you will, of federal Indian law. And this is a very important center for federal Indian law that has really made a huge mark on American history. So I just wanted to acknowledge John, and just thinking back on that fateful day when Browning Pipestem and David Getches, came to Boulder here and founded this office. And I think they formed a very dynamic tradition, of the Native American Rights Fund, where Native lawyers and non-Native lawyers worked together, learned from each other, and certainly many of those lawyers in those early days, such as Charles and John that are here, are deservedly considered to be giants today, I think, in the field of federal Indian law. So what a wonderful homecoming to me to be here. worked here for many years, as Charlie has mentioned, and I do consider this my home where I raised my family and spent most of my career. What I'd like to do tonight is to cover 4 areas briefly, as briefly as I can. And I'd like to first of all talk about, number 1, why I wrote this book. Secondly, to talk about my principal findings and conclusions that I made in my book. Third, I'd like to share some thoughts with you about reforming and strengthening federal Indian law in the 21st century. And then fourth, I'd like to conclude by just providing some concluding observations about justice. And then I think we'll have time for a few questions, and then we'll sign a few books. And I think for you book collectors, I think this will be a rare opportunity, because if we can prevail upon Patty and Charles also to sign, because Patty wrote the foreword to the book and Charles wrote the afterword, and I wrote the stuff in between. If we can prevail upon them, we can all three sign the books, and I think it'll be a collector's item. But before I begin, let me just start with this premise. And that is that most Americans equate the legal system with justice. As Americans, we reasonably expect justice when we go to court. After all, the American judicial system has many built-in safeguards that try to minimize the risk of prejudice, to minimize bias, and to try to get at the truth of the matter. We have an independent branch of the judicial system is an independent branch of government in the federal court system, where judges can make courageous decisions, without fear of removal. They have lifetime appointments. We have built into the system rules of civil procedure, rules of criminal procedure, rules of evidence that are designed to minimize the risk of injustice or risk of prejudice, and to get to the bottom of the matter in any particular case. We have code of judicial ethics that require our judges, to step aside when they have a conflict of interest and they can't decide a case, or there's any other reason why they can't be impartial. Judicial ethics require our judges to recuse themselves, and not decide a particular case. And in fact, the Code of Judicial Ethics lists justice in our society as one of the goals of our judicial system. So I think that we can reasonably expect justice in our judicial system. And I think when I went to law school, that was my assumption, that our philosophy was somewhat simplistic back then. It was go to law school, learn the rules of the white man, use those rules against him in his own courts, and try to secure a measure of justice, in his own court system. And that was a fairly simplistic philosophy, but it seemed to work pretty well in the early days, of federal Indian law, during the modern era of federal Indian law. But the underlying premise there is that we are entitled to justice and fair play in our court system. But unfortunately, that is not always so. As a man-made institution, the law is imperfect, and it sometimes falters and falls short of the mark, revealing another side of the law. And therefore, every once in a while, we can look out in our judicial system and see a decision that's been handed down that is manifestly unjust. And indeed, if we look at our legal history, the American court system does demonstrate some very serious examples of manifestly unjust court decisions. From that history, we can conclude that the law is more like a double-edged sword with both a good side to it and a bad side to it. And on the good side of the law, at its very best and in its finest hour, the law does embody justice and our highest ideals and our highest values as a society. This is readily seen in the landmark decisions that stir the human heart. And we've got many examples in our, proud examples in our legal system, like Brown v. Board of Education in 1955, that when Thurgood Marshall strode to the podium in the Supreme Court and argued that case, and it acted then to strike down the separate but equal doctrine, that had been the legal underpinning of racial segregation in America, all walks of American life. And the court in that case, just simply said, whatever the reasoning may have been back then when that doctrine was enunciated in 1896, racial segregation in our public schools, will harm the hearts and minds of the black school children in ways that maybe will never be undone. And then struck that down, as being unjust and unconstitutional. And so that Brown case, it really does stir the human heart to see something like that come to pass in our legal system and bring to fruition, our highest values as a society that are written into our Constitution. We see it in examples such as Wisconsin v. Yoder, where the Supreme Court, under the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, protected the Amish religious way of life from being undermined. In that case, the Amish parents were being criminally prosecuted by a state compulsory education law. And the Amish parents said that if taking our kids away into the public school system beyond the 8th grade would inoculate the values in the children that would undermine their religious way of life, and so they sought to pull them out of school, educating them at home, and were criminally prosecuted. But there, in that case, the Supreme Court, protected that way of life and struck down that criminal statute, in the name of the free exercise of religion to protect a harmless religious minority that gives diversity to our American way of life, as a matter of the First Amendment constitutional right. And so that kind of decision where the Supreme Court acting as a bulwark to protect a minority, a community from oppression from the majority, really does stir the human heart, I think. And in the area of Indian affairs, we see that as well in Worcester v. Georgia, a decision in 1833 that was handed down by our Chief Justice John Marshall. And in that case, the entire nation was lined up to march the Cherokee Nation out of Georgia. The Georgia Supreme Court, the governor of Georgia, the Georgia legislature had passed a whole bevy of very anti-Indian statutes that banned the assembly of the Cherokee people, outlawed their courts, made all of their contracts void, prohibited the Cherokees from testifying in the court, Georgia courts, confiscating Cherokee land, the gold mines, their water, and to drive the Cherokees from the South was the intent, the use of the law in that case. All of the Supreme Courts of the South were also lined up, handing down opinions that were very jingoistic opinions that dripped with racial hostility, animosity against the Indians of the South, the 5 civilized tribes. Congress passing the Indian removal statute, President Andrew Jackson ready to enforce the law to march to cleanse the South, I guess, of the Indian race. and then having the Supreme Court in the form of John Marshall hand down this opinion saying this was illegal, this was repugnant to the Constitution, and in that Worcester decision, it said that we need to respect the treaties with the Cherokee people, respect their inherent tribal sovereignty. They are a protectorate of the United States government, and the laws of Georgia can have no force there. So that was a very stirring opinion. It was the only beacon of light and justice when the rest of the nation was lined up to commit a miscarriage of justice against a vulnerable race of people. So we can see in these cases that they really do bring out the best in our society, that it shows the vibrance of our democratic value system here, in our nation, and it also illustrates to me the defining role of the courts, as a bulwark, being a bulwark, against majority oppression of vulnerable minority groups, and so the courts in their finest hour, really do, I think, act as bulwarks to forestall probably the greatest threat to individual liberty in a democratic society, which is what? The tyranny of the majority, the kinds of problems that our political thinkers like de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill said. Even in a democratic society, you'll find forms of oppression, and here it's the tyranny of the majority, that the courts in their capacity as a bulwark that's their defining role to protect minorities. But on the bad side of the law, at its very worst, on the dark side of the law can be a perversion of justice. And we as attorneys and members of the bar and judges that may be here tonight, it's a constant reminder that there is a dark side to the law. In the dark side of the law, there's an amazing capacity to use the law as an instrument or a tool to bring great harm to people. And we've seen this in world history. The example that readily springs to mind is the German judiciary during the Third Reich, during the Nazi regime. It was proven at the Nuremberg trials after World War II, the conclusion of World War II, that the entire legal system was involved in complicity with the Third Reich in Nazifying Germany. The law professors, the prosecutors, the judges, the attorneys were willing instruments in the prevailing politics of the Third Reich, and willingly implemented the Nuremberg laws and brought about the destruction of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. It was all perfectly legal. Not one judge could be found to enjoin the final solution in Germany. And I think that is an extreme example of how the law can bring great destruction, being used or perverted into a instrument of evil, a tool of evil. And it illustrates how quickly our notions of justice can disappear, when our court system succumbs to prevailing prejudices or popular politics of the day, that our notions of justice, can the disappear. And that was certainly the case in Germany, in the German legal system. The independence of the courts had been thoroughly compromised by the Nazis, who were intimidating the judges and spying on them, and thoroughly breached the independence of their judicial system, such that they became an instrument of the regime. But here in our own land, as I mentioned earlier, we have an independent court system with many, many built-in safeguards in our system. But even in our case, we are not immune from the bad side of the law. There's many American cases out there, not just affecting American Indians. We can look at the slave cases, for example. There were two of them that came before John Marshall, who was probably the most famous Chief Justice of all times. You know, it's sort of like Elvis, you know, the greatest of all times, you know. But he was more or less the definer of our nation, you know, in the early days of the Republic, you know, where he put flesh on that Constitution and how our Republic was going to take shape as far as the central government, the states, and how Indian tribes fit into the system. But he had two cases that came before him in the 1820s, you know, and he wrote opinions, you know, that said that this is morally wrong. It's morally wrong as an institution. The slave trade violates our notions of natural law. But he nonetheless upheld the institution of slavery in these cases, having a harsh outcome or an unjust result for the slaves. We can look at the Dred Scott decision, which was handed down in 1856, right before the advent of the Civil War, in which Dred Scott went to federal court to sue for his freedom and that of his family. Nothing could be more basic than to go to federal court and sue for your freedom. And his case squarely put the institution of slavery before the U.S. Supreme Court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, you know, and when it got there, the Supreme Court dismissed his action and sidestepped the issue. Why? The court reasoned that the framers of the Constitution felt that blacks were inferior, that slaves were inferior beings, and that they did not intend that slaves, even after they were freed as inferior peoples, would be entitled to use our federal courts. You know, so they dismissed that case in a very unjust result. You know, and so that the Supreme Court had several opportunities to strike down this institution of slavery, presented squarely before the court, but it failed to do so. It took a bloody bloodbath, you know, in the Civil War, the 13th Amendment, to finally do that. Even after that institution was struck down by the 13th Amendment, you had additional cases. The Supreme Court, you know, handing down this separate but equal doctrine in Plessy v. Ferguson, you know, the legal basis for segregating the races in America. That was expanded to other minority groups, such as this Gon Lum v. Rice in 1927, where this doctrine was expanded to justify segregating the American Chinese. The Japanese Americans in the Korematsu case in World War II, Korematsu versus United States in 1945, you know, where the U.S. military had summarily arrested the entire Japanese race on the western coast, you know, and incarcerated them without any hearing or factual evidence whatsoever, based solely on their ancestry. And this case going all the way to the Supreme Court, you know, and the court, you know, upholding that military action, you know, during World War II in a decision that safely comported with the prevailing prejudices and fears, you know, regarding the Japanese during that period. So we have in our own land examples of our highest court of the land, with our leading jurists, our most profound legal minds, writing opinions that are very persuasive, that are full of supporting rationales and legal analysis and authorities, you know, that hand down an opinion in our legal system that is manifestly unjust. We see that in the area of Indian law as well. There's many Indian cases, and that's why I wrote this book. Johnson v. McIntosh, also written by John Marshall in 1823, in which the Supreme Court basically appropriated legal title to America through the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of conquest, which John Marshall incorporated from international law and incorporated that into our domestic law here, which basically holds that the act of discovery by European explorers operates to transfer legal title to the land, to the crown heads of Europe, and then subsequently to the U.S. as the successor. And that's a very brutal legal fiction, it seems to me, that the simple act of discovery can operate to transfer legal title to a continent, leaving the tribes, which at that time were, completely owned and occupied and owned most of the nation at that time, only as tenants, an aboriginal right of occupancy. So that was accomplished with a sweep of the pen in an interesting case that where the tribes were not even a legal party to the case. And it later turned out, about 10 years ago, a law professor from Oklahoma was writing yet another book about Johnson v. McIntosh, but found out that he discovered a trunk of papers, and in that trunk had all of the litigation papers of the plaintiff land company in that case. It disclosed a very sordid, unethical legal proceeding there, where the plaintiff's attorneys picked the plaintiff, picked the defendant, picked the defendant's attorney, told the defendant's attorney what to say, put the case before a trial judge that was a close relative to the plaintiff, developed a feigned controversy. There was really no case or controversy there. Went up to the Supreme Court. They did the same thing, picked the other side's attorney, told them what to say. John Marshall, who sat on that case, owned over 200,000 acres of land right next to the case area. The land title to that land and the Marshall family fortune depended on the outcome of the case. Very seamy case that basically shows that if you violate all these ethics, you're primed to commit a miscarriage of justice, and that's what happened in that case. If you read the opinion, the Indians in there were described as fierce savages whose occupation was war, that they had the character and religion that afforded an apology for European ascendancy over these savages, and so at the very pivotal parts of the opinion, they peppered in these notions of race together with these notions of conquest and discovery. So cases of that ilk lie about in federal Indian law. The Lone Wolf decision in 1903 coming out of Oklahoma, where the Supreme Court upheld the power of the government to break Indian treaties, to take the Kiowa land, Kiowa and Comanche land, in violation of their treaty against their will, and then announcing out of thin air this plenary power doctrine, that is that Congress has absolute power over these tribes and their persons and their properties to do what it sees fit without any judicial review and without any constitutional limitations. Where did this power come from? According to the court, it didn't come from the Constitution. It came from the guardianship of the government over the tribes, to wield this absolute unfettered power in a democracy. We see that in the Teton case decided in 1955 by the Supreme Court. Some of my current clients, Tlingit Indians of Southeast Alaska. And in that case, the Forest Service confiscated hundreds of thousands of acres to clear cut. You all have seen that movie, Avatar. That's what happened up there, where the Tlingit people today, they have about 18 federally recognized tribes that comprise the Tlingit Nation. They live in America's largest rainforest, and they've evolved there for 10,000 years. in an awesome, awesome land, among whales and eagles and grizzly bears and all of the different races of the salmon. And they have a very profound cosmology of hunters, fishers, and gatherers that I think can teach the world much, and certainly their art shows that there's a very thin line between humans and the animals in the natural world. But this case involved the destruction of their homeland, where the Forest Service wanted to clear cut, their homeland there, where they hunted, fished, and gathered. And when it got to the Supreme Court, they said, this is our Aboriginal homeland. We've never ceded it. We've never entered into a treaty. You can't come in here and turn it into a pulp and paper factory. Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says there's no taking of property without just compensation. And the Supreme Court saying, we don't have to pay you a dime. And that every American schoolboy, and this is the same Supreme Court that desegregated America in Brown, said that every American schoolboy knows that the savage tribes of America have been conquered. And that even if you had a treaty, these trinkets and blankets that were given was not a sale, but the conqueror's will. So the Supreme Court, though it was willing to desegregate America, was not willing. It still viewed Indians as savages and should be ruled by notions of conquest and discovery, and handed out this doctrine of confiscation, which is an analogy in our society, where private property is sacred, under the Fifth Amendment. And certainly drew from the bottom of the barrel there. We see that in the modern era as well with religion cases, such as Smith and Ling, regarding the peyote religion, regarding worship at sacred sites, where the Supreme Court holding there's no principle under the First Amendment that can protect worship at tribal holy places. There's no principle under the First Amendment to protect this peyote religion either. And so we have our share of unjust cases in Indian country as well. And it's just as debilitating, just as unjust, as some of the slave cases and discrimination cases that other minority groups have suffered. The difference being those cases have been reversed and are no longer good law. But the Indian cases, for the most part, are still good law, and they've never been reversed. And these cases are ones that arise from a pretty harsh colonial setting, a setting of colonialism. They were installed to legalize acts of manifest destiny. And in most of these cases, they have these racial notions of race in them. The pivotal paragraphs or passages in these opinions where they actually decide the question. There's a description of Indians as being racially inferior, barbaric, uncivilized, savages, that goes along with that. So do they turn on those racial notions? They're in the same paragraph, as the decision in most instances. Often these cases will have an apology saying, gee, we really can't look at abstract notions of justice here. We simply have to follow the law here and apply the law regardless of the outcome. And whenever you see an apology like that in a legal opinion, it's code or something unjust is about to happen. Put together all of these Indian and other cases, they do form a dark side to the law, and certainly there is a dark side to federal Indian law, despite its many strengths, and vibrancies that during the modern era of federal Indian law that we've witnessed these great nation-building advances. But I'd just like to ask, though, or explore a little bit, though, how do we explain the presence of manifest injustice in our American court system? There's several explanations that I looked at in my book. First of all, we could just simply deny that it exists. that's a fairly easy thing to do. It gives us comfort. But I just don't think that and some jurists have done that. The late Justice Rehnquist in the Sioux Nation case, just couldn't bring himself to contemplate that the Black Hills were acquired improperly when the government just paid rations to the starving Sioux Nation, for them. And the court saying rations, even very good rations, is not really adequate compensation. I think another explanation could be seen in the closure of the courthouse doors. There's no court system that is really accountable to a minority group who is excluded from access to the courts. And the examples there again are the slave cases, the Dred Scott decision. Blacks can't use the courts. Therefore, the law of slavery is made by non-blacks, from behind the closed courthouse doors with no participation in any way, shape, or form by the slaves. Similarly, in Nazi Germany, the courts were effectively closed to the Jewish people there as well, and so you couldn't really reasonably expect justice from a closed courthouse system. And I think part of that was the a problem in the 19th century for Native people as well. Another factor here could be just to say to ourselves that the principal function of the courts is not justice. After all, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "This is a court of law, young man, not a court of justice." But that's unsatisfactory, isn't it? We have, I think that would undermine our confidence in our judicial system and our codes of judicial ethics. Does list justice in our society is one of the goals of our system. I think another and probably more reasonable factor here is that judges are simply human, that they are frail creatures by and large that are captive to prevailing prejudices, unable to rise above the popular politics of the day, products of their time, and just simply as captives in that sense, unable to articulate enduring notions of justice. So I'm going to lay this at the doorstep of our judges over time here, that they are human, and that by the same token that they are frail creatures. And I think in federal Indian law we have all of these factors there as well, but there's some additional factors, and that is the first one is that for our non-Indian judges, and we've never integrated the federal bench here, there's never been an Indian on the Supreme Court, there's never been an Indian that's been a federal judge, even though our fate of our people hinges on the law. The non-Indian judges have to cross a cultural divide to consider Native issues, and many of our judges know nothing about Native people. They've never met a living American Indian, never talked to a Native person before, never been to an Indian reservation, never learned anything in public schools about them, know absolutely nothing, and many judges find Native life and issues and anatomy that maybe doesn't belong, in our strange issues, in our modern culture, and so even the most sensitive jurist is going to have difficulty crossing the cultural divide to consider Native issues, and that task is made even worse when the principles to be applied are infected with some of these doctrines of outmoded colonialism and race, and some of these unjust legal fictions that are found in the law. And so my book attempted to explain the presence of manifest injustice, in the Indian cases, and understand the forces at work. And I wanted to write it. It was 4 years in the making, and sort of a collaborative process. Many of the people in this room helped me write this book, and it's yours as much as it's mine. But I wanted to try to delve into this at the tail end of my career at the Native American Rights Fund. We, under the leadership of John Echohawk and Charles Wilkinson, we won many cases in the early days. I felt I was invincible, Steve, when, for many years, not having lost the case, but the judicial trend changed in the mid-'80s with the advent of the Rehnquist Court and the current Roberts Court. The court now is trimming back on Native rights. And in many terms, the observers of the court will tell you we've lost over 80% of our cases that come before the U.S. Supreme Court. That prison inmates fare better in the Supreme Court than our Indian nations do. The court is on a sort of an ad hoc approach to just trimming back rights, and sort of a rudderless kind of a court that there's no foundational theoretical underpinning for the Supreme Court's trend right now. And this frightening trend, has led many of our troubled legal scholars and our tribal leaders that are here tonight, to wonder or to ask, is federal Indian law dead? So that concerned me, as a practitioner of federal Indian law. And there's a debate going on among our scholars out there that how to fix this, to what set of guiding principles do we try to steer the U.S. Supreme Court now in a post-colonial world? One school of thought, well articulated by Professor Johnson in Arizona, is we need to decolonize federal Indian law, and we need to root out all of these notions of racism that are harbored by the courts through these nefarious legal doctrines. That's one school of thought, and there's a lot of merit to that. The other school of thought is one that, in my mind, is well articulated by David Getchins here at CU School of Law, the founding director of the Native American Rights Fund. And his view is that we got to stay true to these foundational principles of federal Indian law that were handed down by John Marshall. Even if there is maybe some structural weaknesses here, it's better to hang on to that, because we don't want to stray too far from it, because we might not like what we get from the Supreme Court. In fact, the Supreme Court has strayed from those principles, and we sure don't like what we're seeing now. And so I tried to chart a middle ground in my book between these two schools of thought, and let me just read you from my book as to why I wrote it and how the book was named, and I'll just quote from this. And as I sit here, I'm looking right at my good friend Carl Ullman and Don Morton. Are you here too? He was here. I guess he'll be in Denver. And Amy Bowers really helped me write this book. I wouldn't make any moves without giving them a copy. And my true friend Bud here, I could see his penmanship throughout this book. And so, but anyway, let me just read you a quote from the book here. Why I wrote it. In the very first case to come before the United States Supreme Court involving a significant Native American issue, Chief Justice John Marshall ominously described the American judicial system as the courts of the Conqueror. Thus closed, the Supreme Court handed down a sweeping opinion that appropriated legal title to the United States, even though most of the continent was still owned and occupied at the time by Indian tribes. Since that fateful decision in Johnson v. McIntosh, 1823, American law has often worked against Native Americans, legitimizing the appropriation of their property and the decline of their political, human, and cultural rights as indigenous peoples at the hands of the government. By 1950, American Indians had hit the lowest point and were living life in abject poverty at the bottom of a segregated society bent on stamping out their culture, reneging on remaining government commitments, and assimilating them out of existence. This book examines the troubling fact that American law rendered this destruction perfectly legal, and it explores the need to rethink the doctrines that underpin this national embarrassment. So that's why I wrote the book, and my methodology was to take the 10 ruggedest cases that I could find that I also thought would illustrate problems in the law, be of interest to the reading public, and really study them out to see what I could learn from them by putting them in their contemporaneous settings, to go behind the decision to the extent that history would let me. And my findings were basically that there was a very liberal use of race in these opinions. Notions of racial and cultural inferiority pepper these opinions. There are doctrines of colonialism that can be found, some very hard-edged, hardcore colonialism, and also very extensive use of legal fictions. A legal fiction is an assumption of fact that is used to decide a legal question, a legal issue, and many of these assumptions of fact are very unjust in federal Indian law. And together, I think that these factors here do form some structural weaknesses that do make Native rights vulnerable today. I do have some thoughts. I think I'm running a little bit short of time here.
I would say 15 minutes. Is that good?
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's more. That's very liberal. Thank you, Patty. To move on, though, I have some thoughts about reforming federal Indian law in the 21st century, and they're flushed out more so in my book. I can't really go into great detail here, but I do think that federal Indian law can be strengthened. It should be strengthened and not scrapped. That there are certain things that can be done with a scalpel knife that can strengthen this body of law, this legal framework regarding America's indigenous peoples and our political and our treaty and our human rights and our cultural rights. But we need not take a meat cleaver to this body of law and totally discard it. But even to make these mid-course corrections in federal Indian law, I think it's going to be the work of a generation of our younger attorneys here, my colleague David Gober in the back and Amy Bowers here, that aren't white-headed like John and I, Charles. Can it be done? Can we strengthen federal Indian law in the 21st century? Our nation, it's got a good side. It's a vibrant democracy, and I think this might test the limits of our democratic values. Can we accommodate Native peoples in our modern society in a post-colonial world? Can our modern nation, how should it comport itself, for example, to the last surviving hunting, fishing, and gathering cosmologies on the planet, how should we comport ourselves to some of these primal religions that still that reflect our species' earliest religious behavior? How should we comport ourselves? How should our society comport ourselves to these indigenous peoples? But I'm thinking that I'm very optimistic that this can be done in the 21st century. There's 5 reasons that I have here. First of all, the U.S. Supreme Court is rowing against the tide. It wants to whittle tribal sovereignty and and to not protect our cultural integrity. Whereas the other branches of the government are their federal Indian policy since 1970, President Nixon, is Indian self-determination. The executive branch in Congress want to strengthen tribal sovereignty and to strengthen Indian economic self-determination and to strengthen tribal culture. But then the Supreme Court is rowing against the tide, and so I think it can only do that for so long. And so, this court was very quick to jump on the bandwagon to dispossess Native America. But it's the last part of our government that was wanting to join, the self-determination of the rest of the branches of government. Secondly, I think that the tribes, the Indian tribes or Indian nations, are poised now to protect their rights better than ever before. I think that with the advances from the Native American Rights Fund and Indian Country, a generation of visionary tribal leaders of the past generation, we've witnessed, as Charles says in his stirring book, the rise of modern Indian nations in the United States here. We look across the political landscape and we see these very powerful Indian nations, that are exercising their self-government rights as tribal governments. And so these tribes, they form the impetus and the political unit, the social structure, for reforming the dark side of federal Indian law in the 21st century. Thirdly, there is an increased prosperity in Indian country. Many of the tribes in the contours of their sovereignty have managed to become quite wealthy today, in the gaming tribes and some of the other tribes that have shepherded and stewarded their resources and otherwise developed economic development on the Indian reservations. For the first time, we have some excess resources, and justice costs money in our country. So I think the fact that tribes, have dollars now, that can be put in the hands of some of our savvy tribal leaders, could help us, in this last challenge, to eradicate the dark side of federal Indian law in this next generation. Fourthly, I think we have more human resources in Indian country than ever before. More lawyers. When John and I went to law school, I think there was about a dozen Native attorneys in the whole USA, and now there's several thousand, Tribes have lawyered up, and they have professionals in all of the fields, and writers, such as Vine Deloria and authors, of Fulcrum Press, that have joined our discourse of the mainstream society through the books that are being put out. But fifth, I think that the world has simply changed. We are no longer an abject colony. And I think the institution of colonialism, which was the predominant force in the world for 500 years, from 1492 all the way up to past World War II, the nations of Europe competed with each other to colonize and Christianize and conquer as much as the rest of the world as humanly possible. And so during this 500-year era, all of Africa, all of the Western Hemisphere, India, Australia, the circumpolar world, most of Asia, all of the islands in the Pacific, were all colonized, and that's basically 500 years of appropriating Native people's resources and subjugating them, a very harsh life-altering experience, for Native people, But that mindset it came to an end a generation ago, and we live now in a post-colonial world, and the UN just passed in the year 2007, with the support of the Native American Rights Fund and some of our other leading organizations in Indian country here. But they passed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the year 2007. Has anyone read that historic landmark document yet? It's the very first of its kind in international law, and it sets forth minimum standards for the survival and the dignity and the well-being of the world's indigenous peoples, and it's all of our Native American issues that you hear about and see here in the U.S. are addressed in this document. It could be the Magna Carta for the world's indigenous peoples, and I think if it's implemented, it's going to change the way that the world looks at indigenous peoples. And if implemented here in the U.S., it would certainly effectuate a sea change in the way our nation views its own indigenous peoples, and I think that this is the new order of the day in our post-colonial world, to restructure our rights and responsibilities and relationships between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples on a more just plane, so that the world's surviving pockets of our primal peoples and our hunters, fishers, and gatherers that have an equally viable cosmology and a way of looking at the world as our agricultural cosmologies can survive in peace and justice. And I think that all of these reasons, including in our own land, I think that millions of Americans now don't want to stamp out Native life in America and rub out our religions, and don't view us as inferior savages, that need to be assimilated in society. Rather, most Americans, I feel, appreciate the contributions of our tribal peoples and our cultures and our Indian tribes, and want to preserve these attributes of Native life that bring a lot of beauty and depth and diversity to our society. So all of these larger changes are afoot in the land, and so I think there's good reasons, for me to be optimistic that we can, as a society together, can raise our vision and to a more just culture, where Native people and non-Native people can live. And I think that this is a step that our society needs to take as a more maturing society, to discard our somewhat rapacious frontier past here in the American West, and to move forward and adapt to the land and environment and the peoples here in a more just fashion, And I think that's the challenge for the next generation. And I do have thoughts on how to, more specific thoughts in the last chapter of my book about more particular steps that will be of interest to tribal lawyers and tribal leaders and Americans of goodwill, about how we can actually, what we can actually do to reform federal Indian law and effectuate all of these goals. And I don't have time to go into it, but other than to say, why should we do it? Why do we care? First of all, I think that the cultural survival of our American Indian tribes and our indigenous peoples depends on it. Even though our current day society has a much better moral compass, we can't depend on good looks alone. I think we have to have the rule of law has to vigorously protect our tribal people. And we have to insist on legal rights with teeth in them to survive. And so, let me just close with an observation about justice from my book, and that's the way I guess we could close, and then a few questions, and then we could sign a few books, I guess. I know you students don't have much money, but maybe I could tear out a page or two and sign it for you. And once again, I want to thank everybody for coming. I wrote this. In every civilization, the law is remarkable and indispensable. In the United States, the law forms a magnificent institution. It is vital to our grand experiment in democracy, and it always has been. As a man-made construct, it is nevertheless fraught with human frailties, and it sometimes falters. But because fairness in a legal system is vital to every individual, institution, and sector of society, a single miscarriage of justice concerns everybody. When a miscarriage happens, we must pause and somberly diagnose the cause. The outbreak of injustice dampens the human condition. It spread across the land, places our highest ideals beyond reach. Against that evil, the impulse to resist life under unjust laws is strong. It is seen in the traditions of Thoreau, the wisdom of Gandhi, the words of Martin Luther King Jr., and the litigation of Thurgood Marshall. They followed St. Augustine's maxim that an unjust law is no law at all, and made the world a better place. The urge to reform an unjust law resonates in the Western tradition. And I submit that on this side of the great ocean, there is an inalienable right to justice in North America. It emanates from the land, perhaps planted by the Great Spirit to nurture human well-being. Thank you. Okay.
Will, there's a very good question here. My personal feeling is that those of you who had questions wanted to buy books anyway. So we might just have you ask questions as you go through the book signing. But may I remind you that John Eckelhop, who is, they say the Udalls are the Western Kennedys. That's a little bit true. But there's also the Western Kennedys who are Eckelhops, and so we happen to have I'm not sure how you feel about that Kennedys thing, but John Eckelhop. So my executive decision is going to be, if you had questions, how joyful you will be as you go through buying your book and getting it signed and chatting. And if you're not buying a book, you can wait till the others, and then you can have a joyful time with the questions. But John Eckelhop is going to speak to us for a few minutes about what happens next with all that legacy and issues. So, John Eckelhop, Director of the Native American Rights Fund.
Thank you, Patty. It's really great to have Walter back in Boulder again. He was with us for 35 years, and a very important part of the Native American Rights Fund. And everyone at the office is really glad to see Walter back with us here for a little while. The picture that Walter painted, of course, is one of the challenges that our Native American people have faced for a long time and continue to face. The Native American Rights Fund has played a very important role in meeting those challenges now for 40 years on a nonprofit basis. We continue to try to meet those challenges as best we can, and all grants and contributions are welcome in our fight. We have 11 lawyers among 3 offices, about 40 cases going on at any given time, and the struggle continues against many of these injustices that Walter mentioned. That kind of environment that we face. We, of course, are optimistic, and we don't win them all, but we win quite a few, and the struggle goes on. We're able to get some things done now and then that make a difference. We're on the verge of getting one of those done here right now. Walter mentioned the fact that we don't have any federal judges that are Native Americans. 887 federal judges, we have none. One of the projects the Native American Rights Fund has worked on with the National Congress of American Indians and the National Native American Bar Association is try to get some of our qualified Native American attorneys as federal judges, and I think we are on the verge of having one of those Native American attorneys nominated to be a federal judge here just any time now. We were hoping that would be announced by President Obama today, but I guess maybe we'll have to wait till tomorrow or the next day. And let me just give you a little preview. I think the nominee that we're going to hear about is a staff attorney from the Native American Rights Fund. This nominee would be the first Native American ever to serve on a federal appeals court. In history, we've had 2 Native Americans who've served at the district court level, but never at the federal appeals court level. So this will really be a historic development. We also get some help from the Congress now and then. Some of you may know just a few days ago on November 30, Congress passed a settlement of the Cobell case that many of you will be familiar with. That's a case that the Native American Rights Fund was involved in bringing in, was involved for a number of years in the case. It's a $3.4 billion settlement over the mismanagement claims that we have against the federal government for mismanagement of 300,000 individual Indian money trust accounts. Billions of dollars unaccounted for over 100 years. But Congress finally saw the justice in settling that case, and they passed that settlement Tuesday, and I think the President's going to be signing it very soon. And there's more hope, too. The President on December the 16th will be having his second meeting with tribal leaders. When he was elected, he promised to meet with tribal leaders every year. He's going to be doing that again this year on December the 16th. And it is our great hope that the President will take that opportunity to address one of these issues Walter talked about, and that is the fact that the United States of America is the only nation on the face of the earth that has not supported the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we think President Obama on December the 16th will take the opportunity to announce that the United States now supports that declaration. So despite all these challenges, there is hope. Keep hope alive. Thank all of you for coming here this evening.
I just wanted to acknowledge your courage. It takes great courage. And I give you my respect from the Pueblos for this courage, your courage, and those of you who are fighting, your courage. Our courage is not for sale. And may your families And all those women who were sterilized, may they find peace now in your hard work. And you show that it is possible for the red mind and the white mind to collaborate in courage. Kuta. Kuta.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.